In this video, we're going to begin a new series talking about car modeling and plasticity, so stay tuned. Hey everyone, this is Matt with Learn Everything About Design, and in this video, we're going to kick off a new series talking about car modeling in plasticity. So for the first couple of minutes, I'm going to do a lot of talking and not a lot of modeling, so if you want to skip that, make sure that you go ahead and move to the next chapter. But I want to start by saying that I've covered the basic car modeling shape before in a 1.1 version video. We're currently in 1.2, and in this case, I downloaded today 1.2.23. I don't think any changes are going to happen for version 1.3 to what we're going to cover, but there are some big changes that did happen between the last video and what we have now. So that's one of the reasons why we're starting from scratch, because the workflow is different now. The second reason is that we really want to make sure that we understand some of the basics, and this is a pretty tricky process. In this video series, we are not going to be using blueprints and we're not going to be replicating a real world car. What we are going to do is we're going to talk about things like scale and setting up the proper dimensions to get started. We're going to look at some basic tools that we need to use, some shortcut keys, and we're going to be using a Nissan 400Z as a rough sort of concept. So we're going to look at general shapes and sizes and things like that of the 400Z as just kind of an inspiration point. But again, we're not replicating any car. We're just going to kind of use some visual cues from that and some other cars that we see around. So we also want to keep in mind that this process takes quite a long time. I am not going to do a fully detailed, high level of detail model through this series. It's just not going to happen because plasticity changes, and it's very possible that in a month, the workflow is going to be completely different. Because of that, I don't really want to put out a 10-hour video series talking about car modeling. So we're going to really focus our attention on the basics of working with sheets or surfaces. We're going to talk about some of the tools that we need to use and how we need to use them. But we're not going to be going full detail. We're not going to be modeling exhaust and rims and tires and lights and all these other little bits and pieces that really add a level of realism to a car model. You can certainly carry on from the end of this video and add that, but I don't really want to spend a lot of time doing those little detail bits because I've done a few series like that in Fusion, and there aren't very many people that will go all the way through that. So it's a lot of effort knowing that the software is going to change and knowing that not a lot of people are going to use it. So if you're still with me, we're going to get started. Again, I'm in version 1.2.23. And the first thing that I like to do whenever I get started modeling something like this is make sure that I understand the units I'm working in. So we're going to go up to our preferences. And in grids and units, I'm using the inch unit system with a grid size set to 12 with accent lines every 12. Now what this means is basically I have a 1 foot grid system. Now the reason I do this for car modeling is because I'm using the inch system. It could be millimeters, centimeters, whatever you want. But I don't really snap to the grid. I don't need the grid as a reference point for a specific dimension. So I just want it there as sort of a visual thing. With that set, I'm going to delete the default cube and talk a little bit about a couple of the shortcut keys that you should be familiar with. So if you're working on a standard keyboard, the numpad on the right-hand side, the numbers 1 for front view, 3 for right view, and 7 for top. We're going to be using those a lot, so make sure that you are comfortable with those. If you happen to be on a laptop and don't have a numpad, you can click on the X, Y, and Z up here. You can also hold down Alt and use the middle mouse wheel and sort of drag it left and right or up and down. Depending on where you are, that'll snap to the next available orthographic construction plane. But keep in mind that I'm going to be using 1, 3, and 7 quite a bit. Some of the other shortcut keys we want to know are the numbers at the top of your keyboard, 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. With this type of modeling, I go back and forth between the all selection, so 5, and the edge selection. Now, all and edge selection are pretty important because with all selected, then you have to select a body and then select its edge, and that can become kind of tedious, especially once you start to use edges and curves and all these things together to loft and patch surfaces. So get comfortable with going back and forth between that, 5 and 2. You can also click up here, but it's a little bit tricky to get back to the all if you're using the click method. And you can hold down Shift whenever you want to add or remove from that selection. But keep in mind, it's just easier to do 5 and 2, just back and forth. A couple of other shortcut keys you should be familiar with. And again, I'm going to assume that you have some experience with plasticity. This isn't the first thing that you're going to model. So move, rotate, and scale. These are common shortcut keys if you're coming from Blender. So G for move, R for rotate, and S for scale. And then within those, we'll use some additional options like only moving in X, only moving in screen space, scaling in screen space, and so on. We also will be using some shortcut keys from time to time for things like the line or repeating the last command, which is Shift R. And other shortcut keys you can also find by hitting F and doing a search, or you can find them by clicking the 3 dots at the bottom right, see all commands. F will just put it wherever your cursor is and you can start typing. So if we want to use patch, for example, or trim, then you can do that. Now, it's helpful to do this because you can always find if there is a shortcut key already associated. You can see here cut is C, trim is T, and kind of so on. There is no customization other than changing the units with my install of Plasticity. There's no key binding that's been updated, and I'm using the default shortcut keys coming from a Blender background. Now, not that I'm coming from a Blender background, but the Plasticity defaults are sort of based on Blender. So that's what we're using for navigation and for shortcut keys. With all that said, now it's time for us to begin the modeling process. So the first thing that I want to do is go to my right-hand view, so 3 on the numpad, and begin by sketching a line. I'm going to start by snapping to Y, dragging it out to the right, making sure that it is snapped to Y or horizontal. But instead of clicking, we're going to hit the Tab key, which will open up or bring us to the dimension dialog. We're going to make this 96 inches and hit Enter. Hit Enter one more time to accept the line. Now, we don't necessarily need this to be perfectly centered at the origin, but it can be visually helpful. So before the selection is deselected, I'm going to hit G and then Y to only move in the Y direction. So you can see we're moving left and right. And you can get it approximately close, just making sure that the Z-axis looks about in the center. Or you can hold down Control and snap it to the origin. If you're on a Mac, that'll be the Command key. Then we can right-click to accept. So now we know that it's perfectly centered. And again, it's really just a visual thing. It doesn't have to be centered here because we're not mirroring front to back, but this does help. Next, we're going to create a line. And I'm going to come from this point vertically. I'm going to hit Tab and enter 13. Now the 13 represents the center position of our wheel. So now I can use a center circle, come down, snap it to this point, and now I've got a 26-inch diameter circle that will represent the outside of our tire. You can make this whatever size you want, bigger, smaller, doesn't really matter, but this is kind of our starting point. The next thing that we're going to do is build out some circles that are going to represent the wheel arches. Now, this is a step that you don't necessarily have to take at this point, but I like to lay some of this stuff out in 2D before I start moving into 3D. So I'm going to do a center diameter circle, and I'm going to give you a word of caution here. When we start clicking around a center diameter circle, even if I hit Tab and say I want this to be 30 inches and hit Enter, the problem that we run into is that the start end point is now up here in kind of a weird position. Now you might not think that that really matters, but if we go to place a line at the vertical position, which would be the quarter position, there's no snap there. If we keep coming over here, quarter is snapped over here because that's 90 degrees away from this. So keep in mind that start position is kind of important. So the way that we get around that is we start with a center diameter circle. We come down here and we tap Shift and let it go. And this is going to give us the extension line. So we're parallel or tangent to Y. And then we're going to hit Tab. And now we're going to enter 30 inches. Hit Enter again. And now that start endpoint is at the bottom, which means we now have quarter over here at the 90-degree position. We've got a half position right in the middle at 12 o'clock. And then we've got the 3/4 position over here at the 9 o'clock position. So the next thing we want to do is add another circle. That's kind of a big gap between the tire and the wheel. So what I'm going to do is, again, tap Shift here and then hit Tab. And this one I'm going to make 27 inches. So this one's kind of close to the tire. And you can see that this is a fairly big gap here. So if that visually isn't what you're looking for, you can always scale this down. So we can hit S twice to kind of scale in plane. We can hit manually enter a value that we want to use for our scale factor, or we can simply just redraw the circle. Now, in some cases, it's easier to scale. In other cases, it's easier just to redraw it. So here, come down, tap Shift, Tab, and we're going to do 29 inches and just visually look to see if that works. And I think that's still a bit big. Maybe 28, that's kind of small, so we'll stick with 29. Now, I should note that I haven't pre-modeled this. I've done a bunch of sort of tests, and I've modeled a couple things, or I've worked on a couple car models with blueprints and without blueprints, but this specific one, we're going through at the same time together. Now, that's kind of part of my process when I make these videos, because then I'm going to run into all the same challenges that you run into when you try it yourself. So at this point, the first thing that I want to think about is, does the rear wheel arch look the same as the front? At what point are we going to make a different wheel arch for the back as we have for the front? So I'm going to take all three of these selections. I'm going to do Shift D to duplicate, which is also located down here. I'm going to use the freestyle option, which is F, select the end point of my horizontal line, and then select the endpoint here, right click and accept. So basically what we did was we just copied everything we did here at the front to the back. So back to a side view. Now we've got these curves in the front and the back. The next thing I want to do before I get too far with this is I'm going to shift select these two, and I'm going to move them out, G and X. And I'm going to manually enter a positive value of 33 inches. That puts the outside wheelbase at 66 inches, and that's kind of where I want for this concept. Again, you can use whatever values you want, but making sure the wheels are spaced correctly front to rear and left to right is an important step to making sure the overall scale is okay. I'm going to take both of these, begin extruding them back, and manually enter a value of 8 inches. And then I want to delete these circles. So I don't need them, so I'm just going to select and delete. Then I'm going to take this rear one and I'm going to pull it out a bit more. I'm going to add another 2 inches to the rear. What this does when we look at it from the front is the back wheel is wider than the front. So we'll take both of these, mirror, which can be Alt X on the keyboard. And now we've got wheels left and right. And if we view it from the top, we kind of get an overall sense of scale. Those front tires look kind of small. So what I'm going to do is delete the mirrors. I'm going to take this outside face and this outside face, and I'm going to pull them both out another 2 inches just to make it a little bit more aggressive. I did just make the overall thing a bit wider, but again, that's okay. We're only working on concepts. We just need to make sure the scale is roughly right, and this is going to be okay for what we're doing. So now that we've got those wheels, I'm going to select and hide all of them. You can do that with H on the keyboard, or you can manually click on the hide and viewport option. And I don't need to see this vertical line or this horizontal line either. Just remember that the X-axis is our ground plane. That's where our tires are sitting. Now that we've got the wheels in 3D space, the next thing that I want to do is start to build out the shape of the wheel arch. This is where it starts to get tricky because it is going to severely depend on basically the vehicle that you're creating. If you want it to be a true arc, you certainly can. But in most cases, what we're going to end up seeing is somewhere around the midpoint, this 3/4 point or the transition, that arc changes. So what I want to do is I want to show a process that Nick showed me when I was chatting with him a couple weeks ago, and that's to use unjoin. So we're going to select everything. So hold down Shift, select the circles at the front and the back, and then hit Alt-J. When we use unjoin, what ends up happening is all the intersection points here become trims, and then each of those curves that are trimmed are separated. If you were to use the split curve option, what ends up happening is you just insert a point somewhere along that curve, and then you have to unjoin it anyways. I don't need this midline, I don't need the center lines here, and I actually don't really need these bottom curves, so I'm going to delete them. And then I want to build out the rest of what this wheel arch looks like. So part of that is me determining where my ground plane is, and then how much I want the wheel arch or the bottom of the vehicle to be sitting above that. So I just drew a horizontal line on the X-axis, G, Z to move it in Z, and then I want to manually move it up a distance of +5 inches. Now, that's probably a bit more ground clearance than we would want to see on a concept car, but this gives me a reference point. Then what I need to do is I need to extend these down until they reach that point. Now, in some cases, what's going to end up happening is it's going to roll under the vehicle or it's going to have some sort of unique shape. We're going to deal with the shape in 3D, but for right now, we're only looking at it from directly on the side. So you need to determine what this looks like from the side of the vehicle. So what I'm going to actually end up doing is I'm going to take this point here and I'm going to say G and Z and move it down. Remember, you can hold down Control if you want to snap. We're only moving in Z, so it's going to snap right in that location. And that allows me to put this exactly in the right spot. And if I want this to just come straight down, all I need to do now is just draw lines down to it. Again, Shift and A is the shortcut for line, or Shift and R for repeat last command. So at the front, if we want it to go straight down, this is a valid option. If you want it to continue to curve, but you don't want that curve to be a true arc like we had here, we have some other options. So I'm going to delete these lines. I'm going to take this one here and say G and Y, move it in the Y direction, and I'm going to move it back, let's say about half an inch. You can manually enter this value if you want. You can hit Tab so you get down here. And then what I want to do is I want to connect this with tangency. I want a smooth transition to the end point of this line. Now, there are two ways that we can do this. We can select these vertices and hit L for loft. On that second vertice, we would want to use G1 for tangency. And the bottom one here, we're going to put G0. So it's just connected. Right click to accept. The other way we could do this is with the bridge curve. And essentially, we're going to have the same option. So at the second one, we're going to do G0. But you can see I actually made the wrong selection there. So I'm going to hit escape. We'll do it again. So bridge curve, we're going to go from here, and we want to snap to that point. So G0 at the end, G1 at the start, and you can see that it does look to, or appears to be the same. Right click to accept. And now we've got it slowly arcing inward. I want to take this, and these two here, and join them together. And then we're going to repeat the process on the back. Now on the back, we can go straight down if we want to, or we can kind of repeat the process. So I'm going to start with G, Z, and then Control to snap here, then Y, and then I'm going to tab until we're at minus 0.5, and then right click to accept and repeat the process. I'm going to go ahead and use the loft option for bridge vertex, G0 at the end, G1 at the start, and then we'll repeat the process here. So L, G0 at the end, G1 at the start. And this line, again, we have it in the back here, so we want to continue to use it. But I can take this endpoint and just move it so that we're not dealing with it in the front anymore. And you can see what we have now is we've got this inside curve, outside curve. We want to take these two, and I'm going to just join them all together with J. Now, I do this for two reasons. One, to keep everything over here a little bit cleaner. I don't want hundreds of curves. And two, it doesn't really need to be separated. If we take a look at the curves here, so use 2 to select just the curves, you'll notice that it's selecting everything here. But when we go to add a line, we'll be able to snap to that position. And when we move this out in 3D, if we need to separate it, we certainly can. So we're going to go back to our all selection, and then we'll move on to doing this at the rear. So at the rear, it's actually going to end up stopping a little bit short of this line. I'm going to have the rear raised up a little bit. At the front, it's still going to come down here. And I'm just going to take this line here, this edge. Let's go ahead and select it. We're going to do G, Z, hold down Control, snap there. Shift A for line. Shift A again. And we'll just bring this one straight down. Now, in a lot of cases, you'll notice that the rear arch is going to have less shape than the front, and that's just simply based on the shape of the front bumper and sort of the way that things work. But in reality, even though this is straight down as we're looking at it from the side, when we go to a front view or an isometric view, we're going to have it roll under the vehicle. So right now it appears to be flat, but it really won't be flat in reality. So now I want to take this line, GZ, and I want to move it up. Let's make it 2 inches and see what that looks like. It looks okay. And then I want to take this line GZ Control to snap here. And I'm going to bring this one straight down as well. And we'll do Shift A one more time. And then I can get rid of this line. Don't really need to see it. So once again, now we want to combine everything. So select each of these curves. You can also box select them and hit J for join. It's just a little bit quicker depending on what you have available to select. So in the rear, we did a very simple straight up and down, made the back bumper a little bit higher. In the front, we used bridge curve and bridge vertex to get a little bit more shape, but they all end at the same height with the exception of the rear one is a little bit higher. This is a good time for us to save since we haven't saved yet. And let's go ahead, I'm going to add a new folder in here. Let's go ahead and call this one a car series. And I'm just going to call this concept car. Very unique title. Okay, so now at this point, we've got our 2D layout. And I should just say in this first video, it's already 20 minutes, but we're only going to be building out these wheel arch surfaces. And then in the next video, we'll carry on and start to build out more. Throughout these videos, I'm probably going to keep referring to them as surfaces and not sheets. It's the same thing. So I'm going to bring back my front and rear wheels because these are going to represent kind of where the surfaces are going to be. Now from the front, we need to make sure that we are in front of the wheel or, outside of the wheel because it's there for a reason. The arch is there to make sure all the road grime and everything goes up into it. And then what we're going to do is we're going to sort of have it curve under. So the curve under is a little bit tricky. So I'm going to start from the side. I'm going to start with just a basic line. And I'm going to do Shift D to duplicate, Z to move it in only the Z direction. And I'm going to put it down here somewhere. So what I basically did was I created these straight lines because from our top view, 7, I'm going to go ahead and move them in the X direction until they're outside of the wheel. And then rotate this around. Just the lower one from the front, I'm going to move in the X direction so that it exposes the wheel a little bit. Now these are perfectly straight at this point. So I want to shift select both and use rebuild. Now what rebuild is going to allow us to do is add internal vertices. So now we can add a bit of curvature. So these internal vertices are essentially in the right position. So in reality, what I want to do is G and X and just move these back ones back a little bit and do the same thing here. Now we're getting away from precise input. Now when we laid out the wheels, we laid out the arches, we used some numerical inputs. At this point and from here on out, it's mainly going to be visual. We're just going to look at this shape. And when we have a top and a bottom curve, we'll move them together so that they maintain that sense of sort of similarity, but we're not going to be really entering any values unless we add a fillet or something. So this is the basic shape that we're going to create, but if we just loft between this one to this one, it's just going to be up and down straight. So we're going to take a line, go to these endpoints, we'll do the same thing here, go to these endpoints, shift select both, and then we'll rebuild them. Now from the front, what we want to do is we want to start to add some shape. So box select those internal vertices, G and G to move in plane, and I want top down to be fairly flat, and I want the curve to happen more down here. And then if we want to add any intermediate lines, we can go ahead and add additional lines in here. But let's go ahead and just see what this looks like. So top and bottom, L for loft, select this, shift, select this, right click, and this is the surface where we're going to project or imprint or cut the surface away for our wheel arch. So you can see the tires slightly exposed at the bottom, and this sort of rolls under. And one thing that this isn't going to do, or isn't really going to help us with, is add any additional detail underneath. But remember, when we decided, or when we created the height of the wheel arch, we made it fairly high, 5 or 6 inches. It gives me a little bit more freedom to help it roll under the body from this point. So I'm not too concerned with the lack of curvature of the surface. So this is going to be a great starting point. Next, I'm going to take these 4 curves that I used to create that surface, and I'm just going to move them G, Y until they're ahead of the rear. Now, the reason I'm doing this is because I want to keep the same or similar curvature, but maybe change it just a little bit. So GX, we want that top curve to be outside of the wheel. And if we want to change the curvature, maybe make the back bulge in a little bit more, what we can do is we can try to manipulate this entire edge, GX, and pull it back. And you'll notice that it gets away from these other vertices. Now, what ends up happening is basically what we did was we moved the entire curve. So we need to take this vertex, G, and I'm going to move it just in X because that's exactly what I did for that other edge. And then hold down Control, again, Command if you're on a Mac. We'll do the same thing down here, G, X, hold down Control or Command. And now those vertices should be blue. If one of them is purple, that means it didn't connect. So Control Z to undo that, and G, and then I'm going to go ahead and just, let's see, rotate this around, X, and let's hit escape. I want to rotate it around so I can see that vertex. So G, X, and then it says CV end next to the tooltip, and now it should be blue. If it's not, then it looks like we might need to maybe move this one, GG, hold down Control, and there, now it's blue. If that vertex doesn't turn blue, this means it's really not going to allow you to use it for a patch or a loft or anything like that. Because we lofted the front, let's go ahead and just select these, hit F on the keyboard and patch. And now you can see that we're starting to create that surface. It's a little bit different on the back, not wildly different. And I no longer need these curves anymore, so I'm going to select them and hit delete. If we ever need them back for some reason, you can always select an edge and duplicate it with Shift D. And this will allow you to have a curve. I'm going to go ahead and just move it out so we can see it. So you can see that we've got a curve that matches that edge, and we could continue to manipulate it if we wanted to. So if you ever want to rebuild a surface with slightly different shape, you can always duplicate its edges and then continue to manipulate it from there until you're happy with it. All right, so now that we're at this point, the next step in the process is to turn these larger surfaces into only having the area that we want for our wheel arch. And there's a couple ways that we can do this, but the two main ways that I'm going to show, one is cut, which is the easiest way, and the other is imprint. So we're going to select our curve, C on the keyboard for cut, and then select our sheet, right click, and now these two are separated. So I can delete or hide that outside piece. The other way to do this is with Shift and I, which is imprint. And the main difference here is that this is still a single sheet. So what we have to do is select the outside portion and do Shift Delete, which will unjoin it and delete the rest of that selection. So this leaves us with the surfaces that represent our basic wheel arches. Again, we could make more changes to them, we can trim them, and we can roll them under. But for right now, these are the basic shapes. These curves are actually going to be somewhat helpful for me to keep. So I'm going to rename them, double click, front arch 2D, and I'm going to rename this one my rear arch 2D, and just simply hide them. So the main reason I want to keep those is because while I can duplicate edges, I can do a Shift D and I can begin moving this back. What ends up happening, because that curve isn't planar, I need to take this, scale it, I need to move my pivot point with V to the origin, and then I need to scale only in X, so I'm going to hit X and 0 on the keyboard. So what that allows us to do is pull that entire curve down to 0. But you'll notice that the downside to that is because we went from a 2D curve into 3D, back to 2D, in order to get the tolerance, because it's not a true arc anymore. It's now this curve with all of these internal vertices. Now, if you take a look at that and you compare it to the original, let's go ahead and turn this one on. The original one, that only had a start and an end point, or really it only had a start point. So that's why those 2D arches, I'm going to just keep for now. I might never need them, but they're much easier to use than would be to duplicate a curve and pull it back into 2D like that, just because it's much more difficult to control the curvature that way. But this is the basic starting point. I know that we haven't really done much in the past 30 minutes, but getting to this point is important to understand the scale of the object that you're creating. And it's important to understand some of these basic tools like creating a sheet with loft or patch, using imprint and cut, and just basic understanding of working with curves. So using the snap option by holding control or command and being able to just fill in these little bits and pieces. Now, once you have this starting point, the next step is for us to think about building surfaces in between them. We can decide to start with the hood or the front fender or the bumpers or something like that. And there's really not a right or a wrong way to go about this. A lot of people will spend the time to build an elaborate curved network, which is certainly an option. But in order for us to do this in a video, I want to progress by building these surfaces so we can have some sort of visual goal to work toward. If we build out all this giant curved network, it's a lot of work with curves, and it's a long time before we ever get to start to build out those surfaces. So in the next video, we're going to get started carrying on adding some additional curves, but beginning to build out some surfaces. I think I'll probably start with the front end, start building out the hood and start building out the front fender. I think that's a great place to start because it gives you a real sense of the vehicle that you're creating, and then you can kind of make design decisions as you go along. So from here, let's make sure that everything is saved. If you are going to be carrying on with the series, you are going to be following along with your own design. So if you end up joining partway through one of the videos, you are going to have to go back to the original video and start to create your own design. At some point, maybe at the very end, I'll provide a model, but I think it's really important that you get to these stages on your own and are able to create them. If you have any questions so far, please let me know. As always, thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.